NATO military aid reaches Ukrainian forward units during an active assault, and 4 positions that had resisted every previous attempt for 13 weeks fall in 71 hours as the specific capability gap each position exploited is closed in sequence. Wednesday, 2:44 a.m., a forward logistics point 7 kilometers behind the contact line in Donetsk Oblast. A Ukrainian battalion commander stood beside a flatbed truck and watched a forklift move the last pallet of AGM-88 HIMARS anti-radiation missiles into the covered storage space his logistics sergeant had prepared 2 days earlier. The truck was the 7th in a convoy of 9 that had arrived in staggered 30-minute intervals since 11 p.m. The standard delivery pattern that spread the vehicles across a wide enough time window to prevent any single ISR collection pass from capturing the convoy's full volume. The 9 trucks had delivered, between them, the 4 specific capability packages that the battalion commander had requested through the NATO military aid coordination mechanism 9 weeks ago. 9 weeks from request submission to delivery, he had been told to expect 8. 1 week's additional delay because a transport arrangement had changed when the primary rail corridor developed a 3-day maintenance closure. He had adjusted his planning to 11 weeks to build margin. The aid had arrived in week 9. He had 2 extra weeks. He used them for additional rehearsals. What the 9 trucks contained: the HIMARS missiles for the primary problem, a Russian Krasukha 4 electronic warfare system that had been jamming Ukrainian drone guidance in the sector for 11 weeks, making persistent ISR coverage of the 4 target positions impossible, and therefore making accurate preparation fires impossible against positions the reconnaissance picture could not maintain. An additional consignment of Starstreak man-portable air defense missiles for the secondary problem. A Russian Ka-52 attack helicopter that had been the primary tool for disrupting Ukrainian assault elements at the moment of their final approach, using its 9Km121 Viker guided missiles from ranges outside the Ukrainian infantry's Stinger engagement envelope. 22 additional M113 armored personnel carriers for the third problem. The exposed dismounted approach that the 4 positions all required, across terrain where the infantry had been taking prohibitive casualties from Russian artillery registered on the approach corridors, and 4 replacement targeting pods for the battalion's Puma UAS fleet, replacing units damaged in the EW environment that the Krasukha 4 had been generating for 11 weeks. 4 problems, 4 packages, 1 convoy sequence, 1 9-week wait. The 4 positions had been identified as the critical terrain that prevented the battalion from advancing its sector of the contact line by the 3.4 kilometers the brigade's operational plan required. Not 4 random positions. 4 positions that formed a mutually dependent defensive cluster, each one positioned to observe and fire on attacks against the other 3. A classic strong point mutual support geometry that the battalion had been unable to attack successfully because every previous attempt had encountered the same sequence. The Krasukha 4 degraded the drone guidance before the preparation fires could be accurately delivered. The preparation fires were therefore insufficiently precise to suppress the Ka-52 observation posts before they could vector the helicopter to the assault element. The Ka-52 engaged the assault element on its final approach, and the assault withdrew before reaching the position's outer perimeter. The sequence had played out identically in 3 previous attempts over 13 weeks. The battalion commander had submitted his aid request after the first attempt, identifying the sequence and naming the specific capabilities that would break each step. He had waited 9 weeks. He was going to execute within 72 hours of the delivery because he had spent 2 extra weeks rehearsing exactly this plan. Subscribe and hit the bell. This level of operational detail runs here every week. The HIMARS strike on the Krasukha 4 was the operation's first action and its enabling condition for everything that followed. The Krasukha 4 is a ground-based electronic warfare system that transmits on frequencies between 6 and 18 GHz to suppress or degrade airborne radar and communication systems within its coverage area. Its transmission is its vulnerability. Active suppression requires active emission, and active emission is detectable by an anti-radiation missile seeker from standoff range. The harm seeker locks onto the emission source, and the missile homes on it regardless of whether the source attempts to shut down after launch. The AGM-88's memory mode guides to the emitter's last known position if the transmission stops, defeating the standard Soviet-era countermeasure of shutting down the radar when a harm launch is detected. What's your assessment? Type A if you believe the Krasukha 4 EW jamming, denying persistent ISR and therefore accurate preparation fires, was the single capability that had been enabling the entire defensive sequence for 13 weeks. Type C if you believe the Ka-52 helicopter, the terminal engagement tool that disrupted the assault element at the moment of final approach, was the decisive defensive capability, since removing the Krasukha would not have addressed the helicopter threat that had been the direct cause of each withdrawal. Drop your full tactical analysis in the comments. The Krasukha 4's position had been approximately geolocated 6 weeks earlier by a Ukrainian signals intelligence team whose Prophet system had tracked its emission pattern, but the geolocation accuracy had been insufficient for a direct strike, 83 meters rather than the 30-meter threshold for a reliable kill. The 4 replacement Puma targeting pods in the convoy delivery carried an upgraded imaging sensor that could generate precise coordinates from the Krasukha 4's vehicle signature in the 30-second window after its emission activated, but before it could displace if the Puma was already in position above its approximate location when the transmission began. The battalion's signals intelligence team would cue the Puma crew when emission activity indicated the Krasukha was in its operational cycle. The Puma would generate precise coordinates. The harm would be fired within the displacement window. The entire sequence had been rehearsed 7 times in the 2 extra weeks. At 3:17 a.m. on Wednesday, 33 minutes after the last convoy truck arrived, the signals intelligence team flagged an emission consistent with the Krasukha 4's operational cycle beginning. The Puma carrying the replacement targeting pod was already airborne above the approximate position, having been launched at 2:55 a.m. in anticipation of the emission window. The pod generated coordinates at 3:18 a.m. to 26-meter accuracy. The harm was fired at 3:19 a.m. from a Ukrainian Su-27 that had been holding a pre-planned orbit south of the sector since 3:00 a.m. The Krasukha 4 detected the launch at 3:19:22 a.m. and shut down its emission at 3:19:24 a.m. The harm's memory mode guided to the last transmitted position. The missile impacted at 3:20:11 a.m., 47 seconds after the emission shut down. Post-strike imagery confirmed the Krasukha 4's primary vehicle as destroyed. The sector's drone guidance environment changed within 11 minutes of the impact as the secondary EW system that had been operating under the Krasukha's coverage umbrella lost its coordination source and began operating in reduced effectiveness standalone mode. The Puma's navigation success rate in the sector went from the 34% that the 11 weeks of Krasukha coverage had produced to 91% in the first hour after the strike. The Starstreak engagement occurred on the operation's first full day, 14 hours after the harm strike, when the Ka-52 that had been operating in the sector made its first appearance since the Krasukha went down. The helicopter had been vectored from its forward operating base to investigate the loss of the Krasukha, a standard Russian procedure for confirming ground-based EW system status when communication is lost. It approached the sector from the northeast at low altitude, following the terrain masking line that it had used on its previous missions to stay below the radar horizon of the Ukrainian air defense network. The Ukrainian Starstreak teams, 3 two-man units positioned at the flanks and center of the assault axis, had been briefed on the Ka-52's previous approach routes from the 12 weeks of observation that the battalion's ISR had accumulated. The northeastern approach route was covered. The Ka-52 was acquired by the center team at 6,400 meters range as it cleared a ridgeline. The team commander waited. The Starstreak's laser beam riding guidance requires a stable target track and a line of sight that the laser cannot lose during the missile's flight. The Ka-52 was flying below 60 meters altitude. At 6,400 meters range and 60 meters altitude, the laser elevation angle was 1/2 degree above horizontal, just sufficient to maintain line of sight without ground interference. The team commander fired at 6,200 meters. The Starstreak's 3-dart warhead reached the Ka-52 at 6,100 meters, 11 seconds after launch. The Ka-52 went down on the Russian side of the contact line. A second Ka-52, vectored from the same fob when the first failed to report, turned back after the Starstreak engagement was detected by Russian air defense radar. It did not approach the sector again during the operation. With the Krasukha 4 destroyed and the Ka-52 gone, the preparation fires for the first position assault could begin with persistent drone coverage and without the terminal helicopter threat on the assault element's final approach. The preparation fires for Position 1 ran for 41 minutes from 8:30 to 9:11 a.m. on Day 2. Excalibur rounds on the 3 observation posts that the Puma's now unimpeded ISR had mapped to precise coordinates in the 16 hours since the Krasukha strike. The M193s carried the assault element to the last cover position, 340 meters from the first position's outer perimeter, reducing the exposed dismounted approach from the 480 meters that the previous 3 attempts had required to 140 meters. The 140-meter reduction was the M130's operational contribution. Not a dramatic difference on a map, but the difference between an approach where Russian artillery, registered on the 480-meter corridor, could engage the assault element for 3 to 4 minutes of exposure, and an approach where the reduced corridor gave Russian observers at most 90 seconds to initiate and adjust fires before the element reached the perimeter. 90 seconds versus 3 to 4 minutes. The assault element reached Position 1's outer perimeter with 2 soldiers wounded from artillery fragmentation. Both continued the assault. Position 1 fell at 9:47 a.m. on Day 2. Positions 2, 3, and 4 fell over the following 54 hours in a pattern that reflected the operational logic of attacking a mutually supporting defensive cluster after one vertex has been removed. With Position 1 in Ukrainian hands, the ISR coverage it provided over the remaining 3 positions gave the battalion's preparation fires the observed targeting data that the Krasukha's jamming had denied for 11 weeks. Each subsequent position fell faster than the previous one, not because the resistance decreased, but because the targeting picture improved with each captured terrain feature. Position 2 fell in 31 minutes of direct assault on Day 2 afternoon. Position 3 fell after a 7-hour siege that included 2 Russian counterattacks, the first driven off by the M113 mounted assault element's Bradley-attached 25mm section, the second meeting a Leopard 2A4 that the brigade had attached to the battalion for the operation and which engaged the counterattack's lead T-72 at 1,800 meters before the counterattack reached the position's perimeter. Position 4 fell on the morning of Day 3 after the Russian garrison attempted a withdrawal that Ukrainian ISR, now operating freely across the sector, had tracked since 11 p.m. the previous night. The withdrawal was blocked by a HIMARS strike on the road junction it required. The garrison surrendered at 7:19 a.m. What would you have ordered as the Russian sector commander at 9:47 a.m. on Day 2? With Position 1 captured, the Krasukha 4 destroyed, the Ka-52 shot down, Ukrainian ISR now operating freely across all 4 positions, and the battalion's M103s significantly reducing the exposure window for assault elements on the remaining 3 approaches? Withdraw all 4 positions immediately to a prepared rear line before Positions 2, 3, and 4 are assaulted in sequence? Commit an armored reserve to retake Position 1 before Ukrainian forces consolidate and gain the ISR advantage it provides? Or request emergency EW reinforcement to restore the jamming coverage that the Krasukha's destruction had eliminated, accepting that any replacement systems deployment into the sector will be tracked by the now unimpeded Ukrainian Puma network? Leave your decision in the comments. The Russian sector commander's response combined elements of all 3: a partial withdrawal order that reached Position 3 but not Positions 2 and 4 before the Ukrainian assault began, an armored counterattack force dispatched toward Position 1 that was engaged by the Leopard 2A4 at 800 meters, and an EW reinforcement request that was approved but whose executing unit, a ZTEL R-330 ZH system, was tracked by Ukrainian Puma ISR from its deployment point and struck by a HIMARS fire mission before it reached its intended operating position in the sector. The Shutdown system was destroyed 31 kilometers from the sector at 4:17 p.m. on day 2 in a GMLRS strike that had been waiting for exactly this contingency since the battalion commander had briefed his staff 9 weeks earlier that a Russian EW replacement attempt was the most likely adaptation to the Krasukha strike and had requested HIMARS support specifically for interdicting it. The interdiction of the Shutdown replacement was the operation's most precisely anticipated outcome, and the one that most clearly illustrated what 9 weeks of planning and 2 weeks of rehearsal produce, that 9 weeks of waiting without planning does not. The battalion commander had submitted a pre-planned HIMARS fire mission request for the road network that any Russian EW system would have to use to approach the sector. Not a reactive request generated after the Shutdown was identified. A pre-planned request submitted 7 weeks ago, sitting in the HIMARS battery's fire mission queue, waiting for the surveillance contact that would trigger it. When the Puma tracked the Shutdown column at 3:51 p.m. on day 2, the battalion fire's coordinator transmitted one message: execute pre-planned mission reference 77 Alpha. The HIMARS battery fired at 3:54 p.m. The Shutdown was destroyed at 4:17 p.m. 3 minutes between surveillance contact and fire mission execution. No improvisation, no planning under pressure. A decision made 9 weeks earlier, running on the rails that 7 weeks of queue time had built. The 71-hour operation produced a territorial change that the brigade's operational plan had required and had been blocked from achieving for 13 weeks. 4 positions captured. The 3.4-kilometer advance that those positions enabled, completed on day 4 as the battalion pushed through the gap the 4 positions had anchored. Russian casualties in the 4-position cluster, assessed at between 140 and 180 killed, wounded, or captured based on post-engagement counts. Ukrainian casualties, 9 killed, 22 wounded. 2 M113s destroyed by RPG fire during the Position 3 siege. 1 Puma lost to Russian man-portable air defense on day 3 after the EW replacement was destroyed, and Russian man-pads teams were repositioned to compensate for the lost jamming coverage. 0 Leopard 2A4 losses in the operation. The 13 weeks of failure and the 71 hours of success were separated by 9 trucks, 4 capability packages, and 9 weeks of NATO military aid coordination time. The capability that had been missing for 13 weeks arrived in week 9. The preparation that had been impossible for 13 weeks became possible in the first hour after the Krasukha went down. The assault that had been bleeding out on the 480-meter approach became survivable on a 140-meter approach behind M113 armor. The helicopter that had been meeting the assault element at its most exposed moment was gone before the first assault began. The EW replacement that was the predictable Russian adaptation was pre-planned out of existence before it was even ordered. Each element of the failure sequence was addressed in order. The failure sequence ceased to run. NATO military aid did not make the Ukrainian soldiers who captured 4 positions in 71 hours better soldiers. It removed the 4 capability gaps that had been preventing soldiers who were already capable of the assault from reaching the positions they needed to assault. That distinction between capability and the conditions for capability is the operational meaning of military aid delivered against a specific request. The battalion commander did not request armor. He requested the specific armor that would reduce his 480-meter exposure to 140 meters. He did not request missiles. He requested the specific missile whose beam riding guidance closed the engagement envelope on the Ka-52's exact approach profile. He did not request EW systems. He requested the specific anti-radiation capability whose memory mode defeated the specific countermeasure the Krasukha's crew would attempt. 4 requests, 4 precise capability gaps, 4 deliveries that addressed exactly what was asked for and nothing else. The specificity was the efficiency. The efficiency was the 9 weeks of planning that knew precisely what to ask for before the convoy was loaded. The 4 positions on the map are the visible product. The 9 weeks of coordination, the 2 weeks of rehearsal, the pre-planned HIMARS mission sitting in the battery queue for 7 weeks, the Puma airborne above the Krasukha's approximate position before the emission began. Those are the invisible architecture that made the visible product possible in 71 hours after 13 weeks of failure. Military aid changes the battlefield. Pre-planned military aid, requested against a specific failure analysis, received within the planning margin, rehearsed through the delivery window, and executed with pre-positioned contingency responses waiting. That changes the battlefield in 71 hours rather than waiting for the next 13 weeks to produce the 5th failure and the 6th request. Does the 9-week delivery timeline, 1 week longer than estimated but 2 weeks inside the battalion commander's conservative planning margin, represent the NATO military aid system performing at the correct standard, or evidence that the coordination mechanism's delivery predictability remains insufficiently reliable for operational planning that cannot absorb even short delays? What does the pre-planned HIMARS mission submitted 7 weeks in advance for a contingency that materialized on schedule tell us about the relationship between anticipatory planning depth and the compression of the reaction cycle when the anticipated event occurs? And does the Krasukha forest destruction changing the sector's Puma success rate from 34 to 91% in 1 hour, instantly restoring ISR capability that had been degraded for 11 weeks? Tell us that EW suppression should always precede the first preparation fire, rather than being treated as a separate preliminary action with its own planning timeline? Like the video if this breakdown is the level of analysis you come for. Subscribe, hit the bell, and leave your full tactical read on the 71-hour 4-position operation in the comments. The next deep dive is already being built.